Hello, everybody. It is August 4th, 2026, here in the United States of America. I hope everyone out there is having a fantastic week. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about a comment made by the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, Valerii Zaluzhnyi, and why I think the comment that he made is very relevant and speaks to something that I have been saying for quite some time about Western militaries. Now, as many of you may be aware, or perhaps not, Valerii Zaluzhnyi is the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military. He was replaced by General Syrskyi. Many people speculate due to some pretty serious disagreements that he had with President Volodymyr Zelensky about the course of the war. I would say that Valerii Zaluzhnyi, from what I understand, is a realist and one of the best commanders that the Ukrainian military had, aside from General Syrskyi. Many people might point to some of the failures of the Ukrainian military under his leadership, but also to the resources that he had at his disposal were fairly limited, especially when it comes to air power and trying to launch large-scale offensives without adequate air cover, as he was reportedly pressured to do by NATO leadership. So anyways, let's talk about what he said. NATO's reliance on the doctrines of World War II and its slow adaptation to new forms of warfare make it unlikely Ukraine will ever join the alliance, said Kiev's ambassador to the UK and former commander-in-chief Valerii Zaluzhnyi. Yes, I would say that Mr. Zaluzhnyi is correct about that. I've been saying it for quite some time. There doesn't really seem to be a concerted effort across the Western world to adapt their militaries to what it takes to fight a 21st century war. There are two militaries on this planet that have direct experience fighting the kind of war that is going to be fought, at least for the next few decades, and that is the Ukrainian military and the Russian Federation. Ukraine and Russia are the only two countries that have experience fighting this kind of war. They understand what it takes to fight this kind of war. People often point to this conflict. They look at the front line and say, well, Russia's not advancing. They're simply just using human waves. They are incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. They're a terrible military. They're full of conscripts who don't want to be there, and their leadership is inept and incompetent. And then some people will also point to Ukraine and say, well, look, poor little Ukraine is stopping Russia. Russia can't even advance against poor little helpless Ukraine. Haha, Russia's such a joke. I think these are ridiculous statements. Ukraine has, I would say, outside of Russia, the best military in Europe, the most battle-hardened and experienced military in Europe. Their experienced infantry, I would say, would probably mop the floor with any other European infantry if a conflict were to break out because of their experience. They understand how to use drones. They have used what limited resources they have at times to, I would say, effectively slow down Russian advances or make their life difficult, not because the Russians are stupid and don't know what they're doing, but because the Ukrainians have a lot of experience and understand what they're doing. That being said, though, success has been limited and the Russians are still advancing, especially now, over the last several weeks in the Donbass and in the Kharkiv region. But here's the issue that I think. So drone warfare has made it largely impossible at this time to concentrate large amounts of armor and men into spearheads that were used in the past to break through front lines. That was the way of war in the 20th century, as shown by the German and Soviet armies and the American armies in World War II. You concentrate artillery in certain regions of the front line. You take tank spearheads. You burst your way through while being supported by artillery and air power, and then infantry follows up behind and mops up any stragglers. That doesn't really seem possible in today's day and age. Drone warfare has made that very difficult. It's been nearly impossible for Ukraine to adequately concentrate any substantial amount of armor and on the front lines to launch large-scale counteroffensives. And it's been difficult, if not impossible, for the Russians to do the same. It seems that every time either side concentrates large amounts of armor for some kind of assault, much of the armor is destroyed pretty quickly, chiefly by drones and drone spotting for artillery. neither one of these militaries have really found a way around this. They've been using small assault squads to infiltrate frontline positions to try to take hard points and then leapfrog to the next one. That's why advances have been very slow for the Russian Federation, not because their military is terrible by any means, but because they're adapting to this new way of fighting. Drones are constantly scanning the front lines. It's making it very difficult to concentrate troops anywhere on the front line for a large offensive, and troops have to be moved up in small groups to take one limited objective at a time to move forward. This is the way things are being done by both the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I think there's a tendency, and I've seen this, of Western leaders and Western generals looking at this, just assuming that both these militaries are incompetent and thinking to themselves, well, fighting like this isn't necessary. If we were there, if we had our armored formations in the field, if we had our Air Force in the sky, then we could end this war very quickly. Okay, when it comes to Air Forces, how are they going to make sure their planes don't get shot down? Russia is just now bringing its aircraft relatively close to the front line because of, as of last year and the year before, air defense by the Ukrainians, or Ukrainian air defense, was far too thick and potent to even get aircraft close to the front lines. Now, this is something that I think NATO countries would be in a surprise, or would be shocked by if they were to enter any kind of conflict against a peer or near peer. You cannot fly aircraft over the front lines in sorties like had been done in the past. Sure, conflicts like World War II and Vietnam and Korea, aircraft were shot down, but you could still use them for direct sorties against hard points and get them out of there relatively frequently because anti-aircraft weaponry wasn't as potent back then. Anti-aircraft weaponry today, though, is extremely potent and can make short, quick work of any exposed aircraft, even miles back from the front lines. It's not that the Russian and Ukrainian air forces suck by any means. It's that air defense is that potent. That doesn't really seem to be something that NATO militaries have really even talked about. They haven't even really, I guess, considered a way to get around that. And the planes that Ukraine is using are planes supplied by NATO militaries, F-16s, MiGs, and what have you. I mean, these are still fairly modern aircraft. It's not that, like, if just because you're in an F-35, you're in some kind of an invincible plane that can't be shot down. That's kind of absurd. Those planes are just as vulnerable to concentrated air defense as really any other one. I mean, yeah, they have a smaller radar cross section, but I mean, they're not moving significantly faster than other aircraft. They're still vulnerable and they can still be hit. And also, too, I mean, much of NATO isn't even using the F-35. They still have F-16s, F-18s, F-15s, mixed with other, domestically produced aircraft. I think what Zaluzhnyi is getting at is, I'm sure that he has tried to explain to Western military leaders, hey, this is how warfare has to be fought. Okay, it's not necessarily about who has the most advanced weaponry. It's who understands the weaponry that they're using. Let's take glide bombs, for example, the FABs that Russia's using. They're cheap. They can be launched from a fairly cheap aircraft like an Su-35, miles back from the front lines. It's more potent than tube artillery. It's much more potent than drones, and they're cheaper than ballistic missiles. And Russia has a lot of them, That's not something that I think NATO militaries look at and say, okay, so how can we take a tactic like that and adapt it to ourselves? Because clearly this is working for the Russian Federation. I think what they do is, again, they look at the Russian Federation, make a bunch of assumptions about Russian capabilities, as they always have, and just think that, well, why bother? They're just doing that because they have no other option, because they couldn't if they wanted to. We can do it better. I just think this attitude permeates Western militaries to the point where I think in the future, if a major conflict does break out, it's going to be a massive hindrance. I think Western militaries should be focusing on being as adaptive as possible. We look at, say, the birth of the tank. You had a few minds in the West that were very keen on using the tank, understood what it took to use the tank, and understood modern warfare. And then when they were brought into the field, they could show everyone they understood how to utilize this new form of weaponry, and they were perfectly willing to abandon tactics from the past that no longer worked. I mean, this is why Germany was so successful in the early stages of World War II. You had generals that were open-minded, that looked at this new technology and said, okay, how can we utilize this to our advantage? Does this nullify tactics that we used to use that are no longer relevant to the battlefield? How can we maximize this technology and use it to its greatest effect? How can we combine this with existing doctrines? How can we combine this with existing weaponry to get the most out of it? And then, well, in the early stages of the war, since France and Germany were a bit far behind on understanding how to use armored warfare, they were swept aside pretty quickly by the Germans. And later in the war, once they understood those things much better, and once the Soviets understood those things much better, they were able to then, I would say, match the Germans in many cases with their own strategical understanding of warfare as it existed at that time. And I think the West collectively is starting to lag behind countries that actually are either fighting 21st century wars or are actively monitoring how these wars are fought and making changes accordingly. Really expanding drone forces, going with cheaper modes of production, cheaper, more disposable weapons, understanding how easy it is for aircraft or ships to be destroyed, relying on numbers, relying on better ease of production. I mentioned before how the U.S. Navy, and I mentioned this in a previous video, is still dependent on the supercarrier to be its chief platform of force projection. Well, with the advent of hypersonic ballistic missiles and the long range that they have, can those still be used in the same way that they had been in the past? Because so much money has been sunk into these things, and because they take years to produce, because entire Navy doctrine is centered around them. What happens if one of them goes down? What happens if some of these multi-billion-dollar platforms are destroyed, like the B-2? There's only 19 left after one goes down. What happens then if your air power and delivering weaponry is reliant on using these things? What happens if you lose a handful of them? In World War II, B-17s were lost by the dozen, and more were produced to replace them. In modern warfare, because I'd say many Western systems are so expensive and produced in such small numbers, what would happen, say, if a large-scale conflict were to break out with the Russian Federation? How quickly would Leopard 2s be lost? How quickly would Abrams tanks be lost? How quickly could they be replaced by European economies? I know the United States economy still has a lot of production capability left within it, despite it not being what it once was. But Western European powers don't have those production capabilities anymore. And each one of these countries only has a few hundred tanks on hand at any given time to use. Their militaries are fairly small. Even if they do have advanced weaponry, they don't produce large amounts of them. But countries like Russia and China don't really have that hindrance. People might laugh at and make fun of the T-72s or some of what the Russians use as weaponry, but they can produce a lot of them. They can be easily replaced. They're not complex pieces of equipment. They get the job done. Same thing with drones. These countries are producing, like China and Russia, are producing drones by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, millions perhaps. They're cheap. They're efficient. They get the job done. If you look at what became the Garand, what was formerly the Shahed, a fairly simple drone with a warhead on the end of it, powered by a propeller, can be made quickly and made dozens at a time. Sure, they can be shot down. They're slow, but if you use enough of them, you will destroy the target. Okay, you can make hundreds of these things for the cost of, say, one extremely advanced ballistic missile that may or may not hit the target. Okay, you can either fire 50 Garands at something, or you can fire a handful of ballistic missiles. Now, if you're looking at what's most cost effective, which one would you go with? And I think that Western militaries would be wise to start investing in cheaper, more easily produced, disposable weaponry and technology, with the expectation that if a modern war does break out, they'll lose what they have very quickly. People often point to how many tanks the Russian Federation has lost in this war, and they laugh at it and they mock it. And same thing perhaps with the Ukrainians. Um, Armored systems are destroyed very quickly in modern war. Very quickly, they were destroyed very quickly in World War II. They were destroyed very quickly in Korea, which is why countries back then opted to go with ease of production and you know platforms that just got the job done. Something they could make hundreds, if not thousands, of pretty quickly. And I think we sort of lost our perspective on what it takes to fight a large scale war and how fast equipment will be lost. I think because the assumption is by many Western leaders is that just we have inherent superiority because of our technology, because of our vast intelligence and accomplishments. It just gives us an edge no matter what, and really not much deeper thought really needs to be given um, to these subjects. And I would, very much disagree with that mindset. I think it's foolish and I think it's stupid. I think Valerii Zaluzhnyi sees this. I think he understands this. He has experience fighting a modern war, experience that I don't think any other Western country can really say that they have. And I think his advice should be listened to. I think it should be taken and considered. I think Western countries should be watching very closely what's happening in the Ukraine-Russia war and taking as many notes as they can and changing their thoughts on war to accommodate what they see and the observations that they make. But I know some Western minds are doing this, but I know many are still refusing to do it and are basing what they see off of assumptions that they're making, and these assumptions are not rooted in reality. But anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about in this video today. I agree with what Valerii Zaluzhnyi is saying. He also mentioned too that he doesn't think Ukraine is ever going to join NATO. I would also agree with this. I think too many NATO member states would refuse it. It's an unrealistic expectation. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think people in NATO saying that it's going to happen know all too well that the idea was just not something that would ever really come to fruition. And I think much of the leadership in Ukraine is now coming to this realization as well, that it was always a pipe dream and it was never going to happen. But anyways, that's all I really wanted to talk about in this video today. This is just an assessment that I have of the current mindset of Western leaders when it comes to military matters. This is just my opinion. I am not advocating for one side or the other. I think Western leaders would be wise to listen to people that are a little more pessimistic about the shape of our collective, the shape of our militaries collectively and what they can actually accomplish. I think it would be healthy to have dissenting voices within various administrations so they can maybe take a good hard look at the status of our militaries and if we're actually prepared for possibly large scale future conflicts. Realistic assessments of one's capabilities is the best way to I'd say would the best way to make an informed decision in the future. So I'm not trying to be overly negative about say my country or any other Western country. I'm just giving an honest assessment of where I think things stand at. But anyways, if you enjoy this content, please drop me a like, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are subscribed, please make sure that you are still notified to receive notifications when I do post content. YouTube isn't very good at making sure that little bell icon stays on. But anyways, I hope everyone out there has a fantastic week, and I will be back in 2 days with another video. Take care and God bless.